From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana.
Today is actually a historic day because it is possibly the first time that a group of the top minds in neonatology in the world have come together voluntarily and pro bono to provide clarity to some very vexing questions about a troubling case. If you are looking for the truth, you don't need to go any further.
On Tuesday, 14 neonatology experts from around the world gathered in London to convene a press conference. The subject, the most infamous case of child murder in British history, the convicted serial killer, Lucy Letby. After reviewing tens of thousands of pages of medical evidence and court transcripts, the panel had examined the causes of death in each of the 17 babies that Letby was found guilty of murdering or attempting to murder. And they reached a stark conclusion.
Lucy was charged with 7 murders and 7 attempted murders. In our opinion, the medical evidence doesn't support murder in any of these babies.
Earlier that day, the Criminal Cases Review Commission, the body that's tasked with investigating possible miscarriages of justice, received an application from Letby's legal team, imploring them to re-examine the case. The story today, why the Lucy Letby case refuses to close.
I'm Caroline Wheeler and I'm the political editor of the Sunday Times.
Caroline, a new panel of experts gathered on Tuesday to discuss the Lucy Letby case. Just briefly tell us a bit about this panel. Who was on it?
So there was a panel that was created really at the behest of one particular neonatologist whose name was Dr. Shu Lee. He is an eminent baby doctor, in effect, in Canada, in fact, a retired baby doctor in Canada. And he brought together a panel of 14 individuals who all had particular expertise. He chose them very deliberately to be largely from other countries so that they hadn't been sort of pre-exposed to the Lucy Letby case. There was one doctor from Imperial in London, but the rest of them were from countries like Germany, others from Canada, a doctor from Sweden and the United States. And they were brought together to look at the 17 babies that had been involved in the Lucy Letby trial that she had been accused of harming. And in essence, the task that they were charged with was to look at all of the medical evidence. And I'm told there were around 35,000 pages of medical evidence for each of the individual babies.
And why were they presenting these findings now, so long after the conviction?
So again, this really comes down to one of the experts who actually presented the press conference, whose name was Dr. Shu Lee, and he had had a previous involvement with the case. At the time that the evidence had been being given, he had no idea that a research paper that he had written 30 years previously on embolisms in babies was being used and was actually considered a key plank of the prosecution's case against Lucy Letby. And as he told me in an interview that we did last week, he hadn't really known anything about the Lucy Letby case at all, other than a very small newspaper account that he'd read in his local newspaper as he was sitting on his farm, which he now oversees with his family in Alberta in Western Canada. And he read this newspaper report and thought nothing other than, oh dear, what a terrible shame. And then found out several months after reading that report that his research paper had actually been used to help convict Lucy Letby. He was then asked to give evidence to the Letby appeal. The defence lawyers working on behalf of Lucy Letby had written to Dr. Shu Lee and asked whether he would be prepared to look at the way in which his evidence had been presented or the research paper had been interpreted. And he immediately then agreed to look at the way in which his evidence had been interpreted on behalf of the lawyers. And as he said to me in quite a sort of modest way, he was struck very quickly by the fact that the way in which they'd interpreted his evidence was, as he said, not quite right. And he gave evidence virtually on Zoom to basically say that his evidence had been misinterpreted. But sadly for him, that evidence was deemed to be irrelevant to the case because, in essence, it wasn't new evidence. It was a kind of new wrinkle on old evidence that had been presented during the original case.
So this was just questioning some of the evidence that had been used. It wasn't a whole new bit of evidence in the appeal.
Exactly. So he was basically told, thank you very much for delivering your evidence, but actually it's inadmissible because it doesn't constitute new evidence in the case. And I can imagine for this very humble man who obviously is a kind of, expert in his field, who knows this subject area inside out and back to front, he was very perturbed by that. And actually he spoke to me about his feelings about that, if there was any risk that this woman had been put behind bars for an erroneous error or a misreading of medical evidence, particularly if he had had a hand in it, he felt a duty to put it right. And that's really the genesis of how this panel, or this idea of this panel, began.
Well, Caroline, we'll talk a bit about what this panel has now found in a moment. But before we do, as you said, you had this remarkable interview with the man himself. He hasn't spoken to the press, really. What did you make of him?
So we met on Thursday afternoon. It was in a hotel just off Kensington High Street where Dr. Shuley was staying. We managed to find just a little nook in this particular hotel in its business lounge. And we sat down. We were very lucky. There was nobody else there in this beautiful, actually, oak-panelled room. And Dr. Shuley, my first impressions were that he was a very humble, very modest, very human man. I mean, I was slightly scared that I was going to be encountered by a sort of, this sort of eminent medical professional that was going to talk to me in acronyms and was going to make it almost impossible for me to understand. But he was incredibly sort of easy to talk to and was very personable.
So I was busy in Harvest and I didn't pay attention to it. And then later on I was checking my mail and there it was again. I'm thinking I don't usually do medical legal cases.
Yeah.
I just don't enjoy them. So I don't do them. But this one, got me interested because they used my paper.
And that 1989 paper that he produced, the reason he's been brought into the Lucy Letby trial at all, just tell us what it was about. What did he set out in it? How was it used in the original trial?
So at the centre of the Lucy Letby case were a number of allegations that air had been injected into these babies, which had left them to collapse and to end up in cardiac arrest and to die. Cases of air embolism. Air embolism is an extremely rare phenomenon, as I learned talking to Dr. Shuley. He himself had only seen a number of air embolisms themselves. And indeed, at the time of writing the paper back in 1989, said that there had only ever been 57 cases of air embolisms in babies anywhere in the world. And he described in this paper some of the symptoms or the findings of an air embolism or evidence of that air embolism. And one of the things that came up in the Lucy Letby case was that this paper had said that in the instance of a number, and it was only 10% of cases of air embolisms, there was this skin discoloration which had appeared, which seemed to underline or prove that the death of these particular babies had been caused by an air embolism. Now, an air embolism can only actually ever be proved with an X-ray, but you have to do that X-ray at a very particular time. So it's not always going to be present in those cases of air embolism. So obviously the medical professionals were looking at other signatures of what an air embolism would look like. And in the cases of Lucy Letby, there had been this description of this rash or skin discoloration. which the prosecutors had then used this 1989 paper to say evidence the fact that this was an example of an air embolism, and therefore Lucy Letby had injected air into these babies and caused their deaths.
And what did Dr. Lee make of how his paper had been used?
I think he was surprised and shocked that it had been used so definitively.
They didn't send me the medical records, they sent me the transcripts of the court.
Right.
What the prosecution witnesses said, the expert witnesses said, and all that. So I looked at it and I wasn't very happy because what they were interpreting wasn't exactly what I said.
As he said very plainly to me, air embolisms, can come about from a variety of different causes, but also just the suggestion that the skin discoloration, which they said was presented in all of the Letby cases, when his evidence was very clear that those kind of skin discolorations only ever actually happened in around 10% of cases, made it statistically incredibly unlikely.
So if 10% of the babies show skin discoloration, then for every baby that you say you have skin discoloration, there must be 9 others that died from air embolism where you don't have skin discoloration.
Right. In order statistically to sort of prove the rule that he was pointing to, given only 10% of these cases would present with skin discoloration, that would mean there would have had to have been 90 other babies that would have died of air embolism in that hospital during that particular time, of which 9 would have presented with skin discoloration, which, of course, given what he later told me, that there would only ever been like 57 cases of air embolism ever in the world back in 1989, and only 118 cases now, as he's recently updated his paper. Statistically, that would look almost impossible.
And Caroline, he wasn't asked to give evidence in the original trial, although, as you said, Lucy Letby's legal team did approach him later. Do we know why he wasn't called to testify?
Not even he knows that. I mean, he was completely and utterly unaware of the trial that was taking place at the time, or that his evidence from the research paper was being presented on behalf of the prosecution. And actually, there were very few witnesses that were put up on behalf of the defence at all. And, you know, that's one of the things that has been raised time and time again, was the lack of the defence case.
So, having not been able to contribute to the legal appeal, really, having that struck out, he puts together his own panel.
That's right.
And so I said, what if I were to look at all the evidence, not just this evidence? Would she be willing, and would you be willing to give me all the evidence to look at, to see whether this evidence, the rest of the evidence, is also faulty or good? Because I don't know whether she's guilty or not, but I would like to look at the evidence to see whether or not the evidence is correct. I would like to convene an international panel of experts, of the best experts in the world, to look at this case, and to see whether or not we feel comfortable with the medical evidence that has been presented.
He wasn't paid. He stood to gain absolutely nothing from this. And he basically approached this group of 13 other individuals right the way across the world to ask if they would help him to establish a blue ribbon committee of the most eminent experts to look at these 35,000 pages of medical evidence that had been presented to the court. And this group of experts agreed to help him on the basis that he would always present the findings of what they came up with. So he was very clear that the only caveat to him doing this work was that whatever they came up with was going to publish, whether or not it was favourable to Lucy Letby's case or not. And he told me that he was going to be appearing at a press conference alongside some of those committee panel members, where they would be exploring the causes of death for all of those babies and would be coming up with their own findings as to what they had found. And that's exactly what he did.
So, Caroline, The press conference finally happened on Tuesday. It was long, it was very technical. The panel did set out different conclusions to the ones presented at court for the causes of death for these babies. Tell us what conclusion they came to.
So in all of the 17 babies, they came to a completely different opinion as to what had caused their deaths. So the experts were all randomly assigned 2 babies to look at, and they had to go away and independently look at the medical evidence and decide what they thought, based on the best probability, was the cause of death. And then they were to come up with a conclusion. If that conclusion concurred, i.e. both of the doctors agreed on the same thing, then that was entered as the cause of death. If they disagreed, then a third doctor was assigned to that particular baby to sort of come up with a consensus for what had caused that cause of death. And my understanding is there were only 2 out of the 17 babies where there was any disagreement about what the cause of death had been. And actually, they decided that in all of the cases, there was no evidence of malfeasance. So there was no evidence that they believed that Lucy Letby was behind the deaths of these babies, or indeed was there a suggestion that these babies were murdered. If I tell you about just some of those babies, I mean, for example, baby 1, and they're all given different names actually in the Letby case. They were actually given letters rather than numbers, but for this purpose, they were 1 to 17. In the case of baby 1 was alleged to have died after air was injected through a catheter into a vein, causing what we've discussed before, these air embolism. The expert panel found that there was no evidence of air embolism and actually attributed the baby's death to thrombosis.
On the day of the collapse, the baby's IV tissued at 1600 hours. Tissued meaning that the IV that was supposed to be in the vein somehow penetrated the vein and came out into the tissues. And so the infusion was not going into the circulation, was going into the tissues. And so the area was getting swollen because the infusion was coming out. And so because of this, they removed the IV and replaced it with an umbilical venous catheter. But the first insertion was malpositioned, and so they had to replace it again. Later on, a long peripheral line was then inserted at about 1900 hours. Now, they then took an X-ray, etc., to make sure it was in the right position, and eventually the infusion was restarted. But the infusion was restarted at 2000 hours. So there was a period of up to 4 hours when these lines were in, but there was no infusion. Now, here's the problem. Even in a baby without any problems, we avoid putting lines in without infusion, because if you do that, clots can form on these lines. Now, what then happened was that minutes after the infusion was restarted at 2000 hours, baby 1 collapsed. It is most likely that there was a thrombus that formed on the tip of the catheter that then dislodged when the infusion was started, and it migrated to an artery supplying the brainstem, causing sudden collapse and inability to resuscitate the infant. So our conclusion is that baby 1 died from thrombosis, and that there was no evidence of air embolism.
So a really, really different finding. Then there was another baby, a baby 4. Baby 4, which was a little girl, was alleged to have died from the same thing as baby 1. So again, an air injection into the vein of one of these babies. But it was concluded that the baby 4 had actually died from sepsis, pneumonia, and intravascular coagulation, where blood clots from throughout the circulatory system. So again, a totally different diagnosis to the one that the prosecution had come up with. And actually, in this particular case, this baby 4, there was a suggestion that the mother ought to have received antibiotics in pregnancy because there'd been evidence that there were problems in utero. And then the child also should have been treated differently once they were born because the child was in respiratory distress and needed further treatment.
The mother should have received intrapartum antibiotics prior to delivery. There was delay in recognizing respiratory distress after birth. There was delay in starting antibiotics. and delay in starting treatment for the respiratory distress. We did not find any evidence of air embolism.
Again, no evidence was found of air embolism. Again, in baby 6, the suggestion was that the baby had died after being given synthetic insulin through an infusion bag. And again, the experts found something completely different, a suggestion that the baby had basically been subjected to a prolonged period of hypoglycemia. That's when the blood sugar level falls sort of dangerously low.
When hypoglycemia persisted, despite 10% dextrose, a higher dose of glucose should have been used. Because if you're giving 10% dextrose infusion and there's still hypoglycemia, it means it's not enough. You should be increasing the amount of glucose you're using. And that wasn't done until 1900 hours. So for the whole day, the same amount of glucose was being used. Instead, what they did was to give repeated doses of 10% glucose. Now the problem is that that's actually the wrong treatment. Because the way to treat hypoglycemia is that you give a continuous infusion and then you titrate it to increase the amount required so that the glucose will then come up in the blood and come to the level that you require. When you give repeated bolus doses, it means that you just pump a big dose in at one time of 10% dextrose, it actually worsens the hypoglycemia. Because every time you pump a surge of glucose in, the glucose rises in the blood. There's a surge of glucose. And that triggers a surge of insulin production by the pancreas because that's what it's programmed to do. And that surge of insulin will then force down the glucose. And then you get hypoglycemic again. So you end up with a yo-yo pattern where you see hypoglycemia, you pump in your sugar, it causes a surge of insulin, the blood sugar then drops, you test it again, now it's low again. Then you pump in more glucose, and it just makes it worse and worse. It's a vicious cycle that you keep doing. This is a very basic thing. We teach all our medical students not to do this. All right? This is what was done here.
Baby 7 was alleged to have died after being deliberately overfed. And again, this idea of having air injected, this time into her stomach, through a tube, causing vomiting and deterioration. And it was suggested on reviewing the baby's medical notes that the vomiting was due to an infection, so not overfeeding. And they found no evidence again to suggest that there was an air embolism.
So, Caroline, from the picture they've painted there, it looks less like the deliberate actions of one nurse and more like sort of failure across the department, really. And Dr. Lee was very critical of the hospital and the competency of the consultants involved.
I think, again, one of the sort of standout moments for the press conference was when he basically said that he thought that if this kind of evidence had been presented in Canada, then that particular hospital ward would have been shut down.
There was poor environmental temperature control in the facility. There was difficulty in finding a doctor when the need arose. There was congestion at the medication cabinet and preparation trolley. There was lack of appropriate facilities for sterile preparation of drugs. Some high-risk infants should have been born and cared for at higher-level institutions, but were born and cared for in this hospital. And there were delays in transfer of sick infants to higher-level facilities when the need arose. So these are not things that we invented. These are statements given by people who worked in the unit. Our conclusions of this panel, therefore, was that there was no medical evidence to support malfeasance causing death or injury in any of the 17 cases in the trial.
So he was pointing to much more of the idea that there was more of a systemic failing that was going on within that particular hospital, which does, again, as I say, tie into some of the evidence which was presented in the case and some of the coverage that has been given to the case subsequently.
In summary, ladies and gentlemen, we did not find any murders. In all cases, death or injury were due to natural causes or just bad medical care. Lucy was charged with 7 murders and 7 attempted murders. In our opinion, the medical evidence doesn't support murder in any of these babies, just natural causes and bad medical care.
For many people, it will make them question a lot of the things they heard in court when this case was originally tried. But does it count as new evidence? You know, we talked about the quirks of the legal system earlier. Dr. Lee wasn't allowed to give evidence in the appeal because it was seen as not being new evidence, but just as a wrinkle in the old evidence. It was new interpretation of what had already been said. Is this different? Will this count?
I think the answer to that one is no one knows. And actually, when I put that particular question to Dr. Shuley and said, do you think that this will make a difference? He said, I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, the other thing that he did very deliberately, as he told me, in a sort of attempt to create that kind of new evidence genre that seems to be required by the Court of Appeal, was that he updated his 1989 medical paper to make it really clear in the cases that he'd looked at that the skin discoloration was not present in the case of venous air embolism, which is, of course, the way in which the air was injected into the veins of those children concerned. There's a difference between venous air embolism and arterial air embolism. And he published that paper just before Christmas. And he said to me very clearly he had done that in the hope that his new paper could be submitted as fresh evidence. But whether or not they will actually adjudicate that these findings from this panel is new evidence is really difficult, because actually what they've done is they've looked at the old evidence. Admittedly, they've looked at it with fresh eyes, but they have considered the same evidence that was presented in the original trial. So I think there is anxiety that this evidence would not necessarily fit that definition of new evidence. However, I think that the pressure that this kind of event, this press conference, this fresh sort of sight of medical evidence is going to bring to bear on the case will make it very difficult, I think, for the Criminal Cases Review Committee to not look at it again in some great detail, because I think the British public are going to be asking those questions themselves, and indeed already are.
I suppose we should say, from the prosecution side on this, Dr. Lee's testimony was rejected at the Court of Appeals for a few specific reasons. Just talk us through those, because if the Criminal Cases Review Commission decide not to look at it, this would probably be why.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there were multiple medical experts that gave evidence, and the radiologist who examined the baby's x-rays also agreed with the diagnosis of air embolism, because they found large amounts of gas in the great vessels that couldn't be explained by other causes such as sepsis or trauma. And the prosecution will very much argue that this is just one plank of the evidence that was given in many of those cases that they looked at when they were looking at the babies that were harmed by Letby.
Caroline, what about the families of the babies? How are they responding to, the story coming up again, but also to what the panel has found?
I obviously haven't spoken to the families myself. My understanding is they are understandably upset, because if you can just imagine, you've sat through months of medical evidence, of trials, you've seen a jury reach a conclusion, and in some ways you've made your peace with that conclusion that this individual was responsible for your baby's death. And then, months later, a whole new panel come together and suggest that there are different reasons that explain this, and seem to sort of blow a hole in some of the evidence that's been provided during the court case. And I think, any parent would understand how traumatic that would be. And, I did ask that question again to Dr. Shuley about how he thought the families might respond to his findings. And he was very reflective on that. And he understood that it would be something troubling for them to hear. But I think in his head, he wants to get to the facts. He wants to get to the evidence. He wants to get to the truth. And I think he thinks that if the truth is not the truth that was presented to the court and the truth upon which the jury decided, then that's something that the families would want to know ultimately, even though it might cause them a lot of pain and distress in the course of that journey.
And Caroline, what happens next? If the Criminal Cases Review Commission does decide to take up this case, what happens? Does that lead to a new trial, a new investigation?
So it's a really good question. And, the CCRC has a sort of checkered history and people don't necessarily always understand the machinations of how it works. But my understanding is that it can force the Court of Appeal to review the case. That doesn't necessarily lead to any kind of retrial. And I guess, the strength of the new evidence, if it is accepted as new evidence, will be looked at and a decision will be made on that basis.
And if they don't reopen this case now, is that it? Is that the end of the line for Lucy Letby?
I very much doubt it. Having seen so many cases which have taken years and years and years and years to get to the bottom of, we're talking cases that have taken 20 years for there to be an adjudication that there's been some kind of miscarriage of justice. I doubt that it's going to go away. I think particularly if no action is taken by the CCRC and the Court of Appeal do not choose to review this case, I think you're just going to see more and more stories pop up in the media from time to time where big questions will be asked about this case, the evidence, and this woman who has been sentenced to 15 whole life sentences and will spend the rest of her life behind bars unless something happens. So I think it's unlikely that we will not hear lots more about this case in the days, weeks, months, years to come.
You can read Caroline's full interview with Dr. Xu Li and all of our extensive coverage of the Lucy Letby case at thetimes.com with a subscription. This episode was produced by Taryn Siegel. The executive producer was Fiona Leach, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. If you have any thoughts on what you've just heard, and I'm guessing you might, do drop us a line to thestory@thetimes.com. Thanks for listening. See you next week.